Hi everyone, great to have you back for another episode of Hauntings. But before we get started, here's a quick message from our sponsors, Gold Bullion Partners. They help you invest in gold and silver, the real physical metal. And what they say is buying gold and silver is about wealth preservation, safety and control, not speculation. So if you're thinking about making an investment in precious metals, Gold Bullion Partners are the guys to talk to as far as I'm concerned, based on personal experience. They'll guide you through the process, let you know what it all means, and you get to decide if it's the right thing for you. The link is in the notes below this video. Okay, let's head off into the dark and the quiet. Today we are in number 50 Berkeley Square in London. Berkeley Square, where once upon a time at least one nightingale sang, but as it turns out, if you look more broadly into the story of that place, at least one heart was broken in Berkeley Square. I dug up a couple of quotes in relation to 50 Berkeley Square, an address, I should say, at the top, which is sometimes in the number one spot for the most haunted house in England, but that's a title that moves around a bit like an unquiet ghost all on its own. The first quote is from Mayfair magazine in 1879. If there be physiognomy in bricks and mortar, one would say that house has seen murder done. A valuable house left seemingly to decay, with windows caked and blackened by dust, and yet with no notice about it anywhere that it may be had for the renting. This is known as the haunted house in Berkeley Square. The other quote, just by way of a contrast, is by Maggs Brothers Limited, who were, until relatively recently in the scheme of things, the owners of said property and had it for a bookshop. The stories about the ghost are complete horlicks, nothing to it at all. So, where are we? Every house, you might say, is haunted if you let it be. Is haunted if you want it to be. Always it depends what you mean by haunted. In 1980, which seems like, well, is most of my lifetime ago, but in 1980 my family moved into a house on Victoria Terrace in Dumfries. It was a very nice house. We had what you call the maisonette. It was a townhouse, but there was a flat on the ground floor, and then our door opened beside that flat, and you went up a flight of stairs into the first floor and then the second floor above. So it was like a two-storey maisonette, a duplex, I suppose it would be called in other parts of the world. The building, more of the building on Victoria Terrace, including ours, had, when the place was first built, somewhere in the middle years, I think, of the 19th century, but it had been a temperance hotel, believe it or believe it not, which is to say somewhere that provided lodgings and accommodation for people but did not allow the consumption of or the purchase of alcohol. A temperance hotel, but it had been repurposed long ago, and it was residential housing, and my family and I moved into that house in 1980. Dumfries, for those that don't know it, is or was a market town in southwest Scotland, you know, a focal point for the local agricultural industry. Beasts were brought there for sale and for slaughter and so on. On the outside wall, very exciting actually, I remember being very thrilled by it. On the outside wall of the house, it was a red sandstone building, there was a plaque, and it declared that the author and playwright J.M. Barrie, James Matthew Barrie, lived there between 1873 and 1878, quote, while a scholar at Dumfries Academy. And I went to Dumfries Academy in my own time. It was a school, a secondary school, a state school just round the corner from a 10-minute walk away from the house. And the plaque further described Dumfries as, quote, the town where Peter Pan was born. I loved that at the time. Some part of me loves it still. I was 13 when my family moved into that address, and I do genuinely remember being, excited by the idea of moving into and living in rooms that had been occupied by a named person from the past, a famous person, if you like, a writer whose most famous book I already had in my possession. It was thrilling. What had the house been like? I wondered when he walked its floors. He was just a boy. He was young when he moved in there. Remember, he's at school. He's not a man. He's a boy. So I think, what was the interior decor like? What wallpaper or paint was on the walls? What pictures had hung there? What bedroom had been his? And of course, as I say, I was attending Dumfries Academy. And I wondered, and I thought, gosh, if he went there from here, did he walk the same way I did? Did he take the same route past the same railway station, which was Victorian, the same church, the same Victorian and Edwardian houses? I wondered. Barry, I remember doing a project at school, so I did a bit of reading about the chap, and I found out that he'd been born in Kirriemuir in Angus, further north in Scotland, in 1860. He was the 9th of 10 children. 2 of his siblings died before he was even born. But at least as tragic, if not more tragic, was the loss in James's time of his elder brother. One of his elder brothers was David. David, it would appear, was handsome and clever, and I think without question was their mother's favourite child. Some parents have a favourite, some keep it secret, others can't help but give away the fact that they have a favourite. Well, the mother Barry was her favourite child was David, and in the winter of 1867, 100 years exactly before I was born, when the favourite boy David was 13 years old, he went ice skating with friends. I don't know where, some patch of frozen water nearby, a pond or a river or whatever. And somehow or other there was a clash of heads. Two people came together and bumped heads on the ice. And David, who at the time was 1 day short of his 14th birthday, suffered a fractured skull and died. I don't know if he died there and then on the ice, or if he was transported to a doctor or a hospital or whatever, but he died. And the grief of their mother was Margaret Ogilvie, by the by, that was her maiden name, Ogilvie, Margaret Ogilvie. The grief of the loss sent her to her bed for weeks. And J.M. Barrie wrote in adulthood about what he remembered about going to see her in her room. Quote, "The room was dark, and when I heard the door shut and no sound come from the bed," he's gone into the room in darkness and closed the door behind him. "The room was dark, and when I heard the door shut and no sound come from the bed, I was afraid, and I stood still. I suppose I was breathing hard, or perhaps I was crying, for after a time I heard a listless voice that had never been listless before say, 'Is that you?' I think the tone hurt me, for I made no answer, and then the voice said more anxiously, 'Is that you?' again. I thought it was the dead boy she was speaking to, and I said in a little lonely voice, 'No, it's no him, it's just me.' Then I heard a cry, and my mother turned in bed, and though it was dark, I knew that she was holding out her arms." And so I think you can say that whatever had been the nature of his childhood before, that love and loss and grief were all part of his life from that point on. Light and dark, but more darkness than there had previously been. And the loss and the grief entered Barry's imagination, I suppose, twining and tying in a hard and confusing knot. It seemed, and you can discern this from his writing, it seemed to him that the lost boy was made perfect in his mum's imagination. Because, of course, in dying, the clock stopping, he was from that moment left untouched by the passage of time. He was beyond the reach of messy adulthood and everything that adulthood brings. He could never let his mother down. He could never be a disappointment. He was fixed like a bug in amber. And the tragedy, and it's profound really when you think about it. It's almost, well, it's I suppose it's kind of creepy in a way, but he's only a child, and in the years immediately following David's death, young James, he set out to replace his big brother, and he did that by trying to become what he remembered of David. So he would mimic his whistle, for example, and on one occasion at least he dressed up in David's clothes and appeared in front of his mother. And altogether, I don't know that he ever said as much, but it becomes unavoidably clear that at some point he seemed to think it was better to avoid growing up altogether. That he fixed himself in childhood. He was always a little guy. He was always small as a child, and in adulthood he only made about 5'3". So even by the standards of Victorian Scotland, he would have always have been noticeably a little fella. And he tended always, you can see it in photographs actually, that he wore overcoats that were too big, that drowned him. And you get a sense from them that he kind of has that look about him of a child wearing his dad's clothes. By our standards, there was so much sadness and so much loss in people's lives, in that Victorian era, in the grip of the Industrial Revolution and the great societal changes. Infant mortality was rife, and men would often outlive 1, 2, 3 wives, and and couples would be burying children along the way, and people died young, and so the life, everyday life, was permeated by loss in a much more noticeable way. And when Margaret Ogilvy, when Jem Barry's mother was 8 years old, her mum died, and as was the case for so many people at that time, especially girls, she was kind of inevitably cast into the role of mothering her siblings, her younger siblings. She was the eldest, and she, her father was was a man of his time, and she had to step in and become, as far as she could be at 8 years old. She had to mother her younger sibling, and so if you know anything about Peter Pan and Wendy becomes tasked with motherhood, and you can kind of see where he probably got the idea from, because his mother was cast into that role before her time. But in adulthood, her grief at the loss of David never left her. She was more affected by that loss than by any other. So he's made ever present, David, and in the same way that David was physically absent, she became absent to the family that was still there. And so it was that in that sort of generational way of things, one of Jem Barry's sisters, who was Jane Ann, just as Margaret Ogilvy had to do in her time, Jane Ann had to step in as and take on some of the role and responsibilities of the mother of the house. And funnily enough, and we didn't discover this until a few years, I suppose, after we had moved into the house. Somewhere along the line, somebody acquired a second-hand book of some of J.M. Barrie's work, and inside it was dedicated to it was dedicated to Jane Ann, and that's when we all discovered that J.M. Barrie had a sister called Jane Ann, because my big sister's Jane Ann, one of my big sisters, and she still lives in the house. We thought that was really strange, because Jane Ann, it's two common names, but put together as one name, Jane Ann. That's her name is Jane Ann. We thought that's unlikely. That two girls, two women with the same name would live in the same house for completely different, unconnected reasons. Anyway, so Jane Ann Barrie had to become, had to step into the role of mother. As is well known, J.M. Barrie, once his career as a writer, playwright, once he became successful, he was living in London, and while there he befriended the Llewellyn Davies family. The couple, the mum and dad, were Sylvia and Arthur, and they had 2 little boys, David and Jack, who were 5 and 4 when Barrie met them all. And then they would be, he knew them forever, and there were 3 more sons, Peter, Michael, Nicholas, and Barrie became a kind of an Uncle Jim to all 5. And cynics, would inevitably, especially in this day and age, would find something sinister, I suppose, in the affection that J.M. Barrie showed for those boys that were not his own marriage, and he was married. His marriage failed, and it was a childless marriage. But the relationship with the Llewellyn Davies family and the Llewellyn Davies boys lasted until his death in 1937. But for whatever reason, I would prefer. I think it's more likely that his closeness was born of a desire to eavesdrop on a happier childhood than his own happier childhoods. I think he was possibly living vicariously through boys who didn't lose, whose lives were not blighted by that kind of loss. And maybe I've wondered if he wasn't ghost hunting, consciously or unconsciously, just on the lookout in the lives of others for evidence of the little boy that his mother lost. You get the impression that he was always looking for David, one way and another. All of it, all the borrowings, all the living vicariously, all of the living through other children, reliving his own childhood, obviously had its most conspicuous flowering in Peter Pan. I remember being fascinated to learn that when he originally wrote it, he wanted to call it The Boy Who Hated Mothers, but his publisher understandably talked him out of it. Don't think that's going to sell to the market you have in mind, James, he might have said. And so, in fact, the novel is actually called Peter and Wendy, and it was first published in 1911. Peter Pan has run away from his own mother because he sensed that she wanted him to begin the tiresome business of growing up and becoming a man. And Peter didn't want to do that. Peter wanted to remain a child. Now, where's that idea coming from, we might ask ourselves knowingly. So Peter finds and prefers Neverland, and he seeks and finds and retains the company of other perpetual little lost boys. And when eventually Peter goes in search of a girl to not to be with in that sense, but to mother him and to mother the lost boys, when he finds that presence in Wendy, he's ultimately betrayed, because Wendy grows up in her time and becomes a mother in her own right to her own children. And towards the end of the story, Peter, after a gap of time, he goes in search of her, and he finds her. But by now she's an adult, she's a mother. She's a grown woman with her own family. Quote, he was a little boy and she was grown up. She huddled by the fire, not daring to move, helpless and guilty, a big woman. Hello, Wendy, he said, not noticing any difference, for he was thinking chiefly of himself, and in the dim light, her white dress might have been the nightgown in which he had seen her first. Hello, Peter, she replied faintly, squeezing herself as small as possible. Something inside of her was crying, woman, woman, let go of me. Peter Pan's a fascinating entity in its own right. It was very popular in his own lifetime as a play as well. And when he died, he gifted. It might even have been before he died, but in any event, when he died, he left the rights, the copyright, to the Great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children, which is to say that whenever, to this day, whenever Peter Pan is performed anywhere, some of the royalties from that go to the hospital, in perpetuity. And there was a time, I can't remember the time limit. I think it might be something like 50 years after the death of an author, copyright fails. And it gets to the point where anyone might take advantage of the publication, unless other action is taken. And in the case of Peter Pan, Great Ormond Street Hospital were very concerned, understandably so, or the board thereof, because it was part of the income that they depended upon for their existence, and there was action taken in the courts to secure perpetual copyright for the hospital, to retain perpetual copyright on Peter Pan. And there's only 2 books in the English language that are covered by perpetual copyright. One's Peter Pan and the other's the Holy Bible. So in terms of haunting, wherever Barry lived, in the house in Victoria Terrace where I was a boy, I've wondered, did he bring his brother's ghost? Did he hope, like Peter Pan with his shadow? That sequence in the story where he becomes separated from his shadow and he goes crying to Wendy, and she stitches his shadow back on so that he doesn't lose his shadow ever again. Did he hope? Did J.M. Barrie hope, like Peter Pan and his shadow, to find and stitch back onto his soul something that was missing in the form of whatever it was that was taken from him when his elder brother died and his mother changed? This house in Stirling, where I live with my family, it was home early on. I think she was actually the original. I think it was built for a woman called Elizabeth MacLean, who was a suffragist. That was I say suffragist, not suffragette. Suffragist was the first part of the movement that demanded votes for women, and it avoided physical violence. It was all about talk and campaigning, and then later the suffragette movement sort of supplanted it and was more aggressive. There was more sort of physical activity going on in seeking to secure votes for women. Elizabeth MacLean was married to the Reverend Ebenezer MacLean. I think the house was. She had money. I think there was money somewhere in her family, and the house was built for her or for them, for her and her husband, the Reverend, when they were first married. She was quite a woman, Elizabeth. She campaigned also on behalf of the British Women's Temperance Society. Funny there's another overlap with that house in Victoria Terrace, which was a temperance hotel at some point. Elizabeth was a confidant of the Liberal Prime Minister Campbell Bannerman. There's a statue just 5-minute walk from where I'm sitting now. She also knew the suffragist leader Emmeline Pankhurst, so she was quite the mover and shaker. When we bought the house, which was just over 9 years ago now, we bought it from the family of, or the man of the house was a retired veterinarian. And that family, the Lovitts, had lived in the house for 50 years, which I loved. It meant that they'd been living in the house all my life, really. They bought the house the year I was born, 1967. Part of it, through that wall, was the surgery for his veterinary practice, and the waiting room and the stores and whatever. And we've just kind of mothballed it. We haven't got round to doing much more with it really than keeping it as a workspace and for storage. And the sign for the waiting room is still on the door, and there's labels. Those wee dino-type sticky label things for drugs and other chemicals, sulfonamide and Nembutol and other things are still on the shelves, where he kept his supplies. Ghosts of other lives. And, well, it's a couple of years ago now, both Mr. and Mrs. Lovett died in grand old age. They made it into their, at least their late 80s. In fact, I think Mr. Lovett was in his 90s. and Mr. Lovett's funeral was in the church just 100 yards down that road, just 100 yards or so from his old front door. We came back from walking our dogs one morning, and we saw and realised we could see the cortege, and we could see the mourners going in, and we realised whose funeral it was. And it was a strange feeling to be going into the house that had been his for 50 years. And, you got that sense of time having passed. And I'm sure I've mentioned before, not long after we moved in here, one of our friends, actually the breeder from whom we've had our wolfhounds, Gracie and Jessie, she came, and she says that she never actually uses the word, but she's a bit of a medium in that she senses the presence of the beyond and its inhabitants. And who am I to doubt her? She speaks reasonably and quite calmly about the experiences that she's had and has. And when Trudy showed around the old surgery bit that I'm talking about, when she came back through to here, she said, there's an old man in there, an old man with a beard smoking a pipe. And my daughter's bedroom's on the top floor of this house. And once upon a time, let's imagine going back to the time of, say, the Reverend and Mrs. McLean, the top floor was a nursery for the kids, and there was a time when this house had some live-in staff in it. I think a coachman, and maybe a children's nurse, whatever. But there were others here apart from the family, and in the surgery up on the wall, there's a box that was the hub of a system of bells that was used to summon the servants. So there's bits that would have lit up when a bell was. There's buttons for bells in all the rooms, and you'd press a bell, and press a button, and a bell would ring, and a light would go on down there, and the staff would know where they were being summoned. And so it's like the dining room, whatever, drawing room, and so on and so on. And so anyway, on the top floor where my daughter has her room, she says that more than once she has felt hands. She'll be sitting on a couch and she feels hands placed on her shoulders, like someone behind her, and pushing down with a steady pressure. And she feels no fear. She senses no malice, whatever. Quite the contrary, it's a very benign presence. And I don't doubt that she's telling the truth. I don't doubt it. In the house I lived in with my parents, Victoria Terrace, and with my sister Jane Ann, the second to inhabit the place, my dad, he that once upon a time was ready to swear on a stack of Bibles that he had seen my mum's guardian angel looking over her one night when he came back into the bedroom having answered a call of nature. My dad, who was presumably in some way or another in tune with other frequencies, he used to say, I remember like I say, I moved into that house when I was 13, and until I left to go to university or whatever, and subsequent to that, when I was back in the house, he would claim that he glimpsed little people from time to time, like borrowers, yay big, whatever, fairies. I kid you not, we'd be sitting in the living room watching telly or something, reading a book, and out of nowhere he would point down at the skirting boards and say, "Did you see? You must have seen them that time. Did you not see them?" But he was pulling our legs, whatever. But no, he took it too far. Really, he went on for too long to be someone who was making it up. He was whatever. Is what he said. And I used to wonder, because of J.M. Barrie, I used to wonder if Tinkerbell and the rest of the fairies weren't occasional visitors to the house where Peter Pan was born, as it says on the plaque on our front wall, my family home's front wall. So that's a long preamble to get to the house at 50 Berkeley Square. But during part of the 19th, all of the 20th, and still now in the 21st century, as I said at the top, that house at 50 Berkeley Square in London has had a reputation as most haunted in England, most haunted in Britain. Up until 2015, it was an antiquarian bookshop, Maggs Brothers Limited, which was in its own right founded in 1853 by the exquisitely Dickensian-sounding Uriah Maggs. If he wasn't a character in one of Dickens' novels, he should have been. Changing hands within the bookshop over the years were all sorts of publications, if that's always the right word. There's a 5th century Codex Sinaiticus, which is the Sinai Bible, a very rare piece, one of the most collectible books on the planet. It contains all the New Testament and some of the Old, handwritten in Greek. So that changed hands in Maggs Brothers Limited. 2 Gutenberg Bibles were in there and went on to other owners. The first book printed by Caxton in England. And also, and I guarantee you're not expecting this, also bought and sold in Maggs Brothers Limited was the penis of Napoleon Bonaparte. I'll leave that there. Probably better if somebody else had left that there. Anyway, it's in such ways, by such unlikely events, that places like 50 Berkeley Square become imbued with a sense of something strange. It's pretty strange. Strange goings on. You know, just as the presence of King James of Scotland's intestines, his flayed skin, made odd and inexplicable the atmosphere inside the French church buildings in which they were secreted, as I was speaking about on an episode of this a couple of weeks back. So you might say the stay in 50 Berkeley Square of Bonaparte's member sets the place apart. Creates an atmosphere that lingers. The author John Vernon followed the trail of the Emperor's Tale while researching a novel that he wrote about Bonaparte. Quote, in a long footnote in a book on Napoleon's death by the Scottish physician Frank Richardson, I found at last what I was looking for, a discreet and sceptical reference to the story of this Promethean theft. The item was mounted in a velvet Cartier box and sold by the descendants of Abbé Ange Paul Vignali, Napoleon's chaplain, who was present at his autopsy, to the Maggs brothers of Berkeley Square in London. And that was published in the New York Times on July the 12th, 1992. So take from that what you will. But of all the gin joints in all the world, it was that address in England's capital that was made stranger by such an unlikely association. Quote, those with a passionate interest in the past always feel sooner or later that history's ultimate unknowability mocks them, wrote Vernon. This could be just paranoia, but it is more. It is the powerful feeling that history is simultaneously there and not there, real and illusory, a ghost forever trailing behind which vanishes when we turn around. So what is it? What is it about some places and not others? What is it about one location among the millions in a city that earns a reputation for being haunted and for haunting? Why? It's not evenly spread like butter across toast. Just here and there. And invariably it's a place that has not just one association with the idea of haunting, it has multiple anecdotes. Things begin to cluster there. The house itself, it was designed by the architect William Kent. It was built in 1750, there or thereabouts. A Tory statesman called it George Canning, who until the time of Liz Truss was the briefest serving British Prime Minister. He managed 119 days, cut short by his death in 1827. Liz Truss stole that record from Canning. She managed only 49 days as Prime Minister. But anyway, Canning had it for a home. The Honourable Elizabeth Curzon succeeded him after his passing, and she was there in 50 Berkeley Square until she died in 1859, aged 91. After Elizabeth, the house was acquired by a young man in possession of good prospects and in want and great expectation, we could say, of a wife. He was Thomas Myers. This is where it all gets to the point. He was the son of an MP, and he took on 50 Berkeley Square on becoming engaged. And according to a memoir that was written by his relative, Lady Dorothy Neville, young Myers, quote, made every preparation to receive his bride in it, ordered carpets, pictures, china, everything. But a few days before the wedding, in the classic fashion expected, let's say, of a novel, but this is true, his dearly beloved, his intended, told him that he was dumped. I don't think that's the language she used. She intended to marry another, she informed him. And so, according to Dorothy Neville, Myers remained there, leaving everything in exactly the same state as when he heard the news which had ruined his life. What other Dickensian character does that make us think of? Now, Lady Neville acknowledged that Myers was a bit of an eccentric type anyway, even before all this happened to him, but that he suffered what we would call a full-blown emotional breakdown in the aftermath of his heartbreak. And he withdrew from everything and everywhere. He stayed in the house, but he left everything of it just to decay while he was still within it. The outside became, begrimed. The windows were completely obscured by filth that just built up on the glass because nothing was ever done to clean them. He retreated. He withdrew into a room at the top of the house, and he stopped going about in daylight. He only seemed to move around at all in the night, and he would roam the hallways with a candle in classic sort of, Ebenezer Scrooge Dickensian fashion. And neighbours and passers-by would see the trailing, flickering light behind the windows, caked as they were with dust and grime, and would wonder who it was, because he'd forgotten. In time, he was in there so long without interacting with anybody else that he became forgotten, even while he lived, even while he lurked within. They say that he was given to mutterings and moanings that would also emanate from the house, adding to the kind of, creepy atmosphere. He never left the house, or barely, not if he could avoid it. And in time, people forgot anyone lived in it at all. People began to assume it was just an empty house, inhabited only by memories and the invisible. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men, stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, hearkening in an air stirred and shaken by the lonely traveller's call. That's Walter de la Mare. That's the listeners regularly touted as the most popular poem in the English language. Properly Dickensian Uriah Maggs and his books and his business would come to 50 Berkeley Square later, after the time of poor Mr. Myers. But it's surely fair to say that Mr. Myers may have inspired the characteristics of Charles Dickens' most famous jilted bride, Miss Havisham, in Great Expectations, who lived surrounded by an eternity made of the moment in which her heart was broken. Quote, "I saw that the bride within the bridal dress had withered like the dress and like the flowers, and had no brightness left but the brightness of her sunken eyes." That's the observations of Pip, the hero. Like a ship lost, Miss Havisham, let down on her wedding day, had slipped her moorings in the land of the Seine, but she had anchored herself in time, stopping all the clocks in the house at the very moment when she heard the dread news that she was not to be wed. Quote, "It was when I stood before her, avoiding her eyes, that I took note of the surrounding objects in detail, and saw that her watch had stopped at 20 minutes to 9, and that a clock in the room had stopped at 20 minutes to 9. Look at me," said Miss Havisham. "You're not afraid of a woman who has never seen the sun since you were born?" It was then I began to understand that everything in the room had stopped, like the watch and the clock, a long time ago. Without this arrest of everything, this standing still of all the pale decayed objects, not even the withered bridal dress on the collapsed form could have looked so like grave clothes, or the long veil so like a shroud. It's good, isn't it? Dear old Charles. Now, Myers lived at number 50 from 1859, and he was not disturbed there in any meaningful way until 1873, when he was briefly the subject of an investigation about, of all things, unpaid tax. And according to the legend that surrounds the house and Myers, the magistrate before whom the case called took pity on him took pity on the man who lived in what he called the haunted house, and he closed the case without demanding any money, without demanding so much as a sou from poor old Mr. Myers, concluding that the old soul had suffered enough. And Myers died not long after that, and the place was inherited by his sister, but she never moved in. She owned it. She never lived in it. It just stayed empty. So, now totally quiet. The house was made home instead to the imaginings of those who only looked on at it or walked past it. Imagine living next door to 50 Berkeley Square. And they noticed gradually its advancing decrepitude, which was so out of keeping with the rest of the locale. It was a wealthy part of town. And this decaying place in the heart of it, with the unwashed windows and all the decrepitude, was, it stuck out like the proverbial sore thumb, but no one was doing anything about it. In his 1913 offering Ghost Houses, Charles Harper encapsulated the feeling. Quote, "The haunted house in Berkeley Square was long one of those things that no country cousin come up from the provinces to London on sightseeing bent ever willingly missed. But truth to tell, its exterior is now a trifle disappointing to the casual seeker after horrors. Viewed in the afternoon sunshine, with a milkman delivering the usual half-pint or quart, as the case may be, is just as respectably commonplace as any other house of similar late Georgian period, and even the weird stroke of 12 when the midnight policeman comes and thrusts a burly shoulder against the front door and tries the area gate or flashes a gleam over the kitchen windows from his bull's eye. There's nothing at all hair-raising about it." But in the same book, he also recalled the years he wrote about and recorded when number 50 was unkempt. The long period of time when there was no soap applied to any window, when there was no paint applied to any timber, when there was no whitewash applied to any stonework, when it lay unused through all the years, grime building up like tartar on unbrushed teeth. And the whole area around it was choked with, handbills, wisps of straw and paper and all the accumulations that gather, that accrete around any house. It was a picture of misery. And every passing stranger, on account of the reputation of the place, would stop a passing local, an errand boy or whatever, and ask questions, to which the answer was, that's the haunted house. Or if the question happened to be who lives there, the obvious answer was ghosts. By then, Myers was forgotten, long forgotten, and in that space of not knowing, in that space of ignorance, all the excited talk filled the space. Again, accreting like limpets on a shipwrecked hull. So there were all sorts of stories of ghosts at 50 Berkeley Square. Writers latched on to the legends, stoking them and sharing all manner of tales. It began to take a form, the story of the haunting of 50 Berkeley Square. There were kind of highlights and lowlights. There was reporting of unease on an attic room where, according to the lore, a young woman had killed herself by leaping from a window. And, depending on which version you read, her essence, her spirit, her wraith, is either a glowing white figure, or it's a kind of a dark grey-brown mist in the hallway, or in the doorway, or in the room. There's talk within the legend of a murdered child, murdered by a servant in the house. There's a story of a young man held prisoner, shut away and fed through a hatch in the door until he goes mad and dies. Curiouser and curiouser, from time to time there's talk of a pair of legs seen emerging from one of the chimneys into a fireplace in the house. There's talk of something made of feathers. There's talk of a nameless horror. One of the best reports is of an unnamed raw head and bloody bones manifesting. Over the years, according to the accounts that feature in the Penny Dreadfuls that fuelled and drove the myth, there were those who sought their own reasons to stay in the house, to stay in the attic bedroom. This always happens with haunted houses. There's always people that want to go and see what's to be seen, feel what's to be felt, to confront the phantoms. I mentioned at the top a quote from the Mayfair magazine in 1879, and it's from a story that gives us a summary of the events, really, of a man who rented the place for himself and his daughters. And one of the daughters complained of a heavy scent in the house, like that of animals in a zoo. And a fiancé of one of the girls, a Captain Kentfield, made arrangements to stay. And so a maid was sent up from the house, from the ground floor, to prepare his room for him. And then screams were heard. And when others ran to help the servant, they found her curled in a ball on the floor, muttering, "Don't let it touch me, don't let it touch me." And of course, in suitably melodramatic style, she was dead the next day of terror. The captain, who had instigated all of it, he was as good as his word, and he embarked on his night in the room subsequently, climbed up there by candlelight, and he was inside for just half an hour before the rest of the house heard cries and screams of terror. A party raced up to help him, and he was dead on the floor, his face a mask of horror. It's one of those places. These are the stories at 50 Berkeley Square. There's other accounts of a party of sailors who broke in, probably after a night out drinking in the town, and all died. There's a tale of an unnamed man who went into the room, the attic room, with a bell, and he'd said before he left the company that if he was in need of help, he would ring. And in the small hours of the night, the bell was heard ringing wildly. Again, the other people in the house rushed to help, find him having a seizure. And like everyone else, like Captain Kentfield, he succumbed to his terrors and died without ever managing to tell anyone what he had seen. These are the legends in the Penny Dreadfuls, in the Mayfair magazine of 1879. I mentioned that Great Expectations, Miss Havisham and all of that. Now, it was written elsewhere, but Dickens wrote the Pickwick Papers while seated at a table in Mag's Brothers. He took up space in there, and that's where he wrote the Pickwick Papers. So that connection's always there. Mag's Brothers moved out in 2015, and renovators moved in, and since 2015 it's been a private house. As it originally was, so it is now. And there's no talk of ghosts now. There's no talk of ghosts from the modern day residents. But one way or another, 50 Berkeley Square, like so many other locations, has long been a place of stories. The stuff that entertains the neighbours. See that house there? Oh, the things I could tell you. Some of it's printed, some of it's in scandal sheets and so on. And for all of that time, really the longest time, it was a refuge for second-hand books, put simply. So perhaps 50 Berkeley Square, all 5 stories of it, was always and only about fiction. But where truth is absent, where truth has been driven off, make-believe often fills the space. And whether or not at 50 Berkeley Square, between now and the end, whether or not anyone will ever again hear the mutterings and moans of Mr. Myers, or glimpse the mist, or the light, or the nameless shadow, only time will tell.